Hi everyone, Kris from Stone Age Gamer here, and welcome back to the Gratuitous Rainbow Spectrum. Let's talk a little bit about console wars. They're very inherently silly things to argue over. However, sometimes silly arguments can be very fun, especially if you're approaching them from a good-natured standpoint. The problem with console war arguments, though, is that sometimes the word generation gets thrown in there, and without a clear definition of where console generations begin and end, console wars can seem, well, rather silly, especially when worded in specific ways. So I thought it would be a pretty fun thing to dive into the world of console generations and see if I can come up with a clearly defined and reasonable approach to which game systems belong in which generations. Let's take a look.
Console generations are weird because not every system comes out in a clearly defined cycle. But when having volatile conversations online about which system is better than which, it's important to know where you're coming from. So let's get to work on defining what systems belong in what generation. The first thing we want to do is define a generation. How I've always looked at this is partly based on how powerful a system is, but more importantly, what its intent was. Was this system designed to compete with said other systems? Does it technologically align with these contemporaries? Whether or not they ceased to be sold before more consoles of the same generation even made it to market is relevant. If you're basing generations solely on when they were in direct sales competition with one another, it becomes impossible to clearly define lines with stuff like the Sega Master System or the PlayStation 1, whose lifespans, especially worldwide, lasted very, very long. I believe in my heart of hearts that this is the only fair way to compare these systems. Also, I'm not going to hit every system ever made in here. I'm just talking about home consoles, not handhelds, and some of the more obscure platforms like the Arcadia 2001 or Pippin, I'm skipping, just because if I tried to include everything ever made, I think my head would explode. I'd also doubtlessly forget something. Finally, this list is made from a US perspective, so if you know of a Japan or European console that's not here, that's why. Okay, with all this in mind, let's begin. The first generation of game consoles is basically Pong. You've got your Odyssey, your various Pong clones, Coleco Telstar, etc. This isn't much of a conversation starter, because there wasn't much in terms of real competition back then. No matter which system you had, you were probably playing some variation of the same thing. Console-exclusive games or exclusive features, sure, they existed to a degree, but they were all basically the same, and they were all pretty basic. So Gen 1, pretty easily defined. We've got your Odysseys, your Pong clones, let's call it a day. The second generation is where things start to get interesting. This is where things also get quite murky thanks to Atari, but we're going to get there. Consoles are now intrinsically different. They have different controllers, different games, different graphics capabilities, the works. Let's start at the start with what's widely considered the first major platform with interchangeable cartridges, the Fairchild Channel F. Now, obviously the Atari 2600 fits nicely in here as well. And same goes for the Odyssey 2 and the Intellivision. That one's ad campaign took direct aim at the 2600, so even though it was a more powerful console, it was definitely in the same generation. I think we can safely fit the Vectrex in here too. Now we start to get a little funky. ColecoVision technologically could be considered more of a halfway point between the Atari 2600 and the NES, which makes it seem like it could fit in either generation. However, if we look at the system's intent, it feels more at home with the 2600 and Intellivision. Now, if we were looking at this from a Japan perspective, this would be an even more confusing situation thanks to the Famicom's early arcade-style releases and the SG-1000 effectively being the same dang hardware as the ColecoVision. But thankfully, we're not, so I say ColecoVision sits firmly in the second generation. And then we have the Atari 5200. It's pretty weird to have a console manufacturer have more than one console in the same generation, but the industry was still figuring itself out, and the Atari 5200 in no way feels like its intent was to compete with the likes of the NES. This is a platform meant to stand up to the advancements of the Intellivision and ColecoVision. So even though it's the next generation of Atari hardware, I don't think it quite makes it out of the second generation of gaming consoles. This system belongs here. Next, let's figure out what goes in the third generation. There was a pretty clear difference in the types of games being made for these platforms, which is where I feel drawing the generational line makes sense. Prior generations were all about trying to replicate the arcade experience at home. This generation saw a shift to games made specifically to be played for longer periods of time in front of a TV. High scores took a back seat to beating games with multiple levels, stories, and the like. Like I said, this is a decidedly North American approach, so we'll be skipping past the Famicom and SG-1000. Here in the US, though, there were only really 3 contenders: the Nintendo Entertainment System, the Sega Master System, and the Atari 7800. There were a bunch of other smaller ones out there that you could argue live in this generation, but none of them really moved the needle here. The NES is a pretty well-known quantity, so we don't really have to get too much into that here. It effectively owned this generation and was home to some of the most important game design advancements of all time. Sega's Master System was no slouch either. It didn't perform very well here in the US, but it gained a nice foothold in other parts of the world, and while its library was never able to properly compete with Nintendo's in the States, it's a heck of a platform. Atari's efforts, though, well, they were pretty weird. It doesn't look or sound quite as good as Nintendo or Sega's machines, probably because it was made a decent amount of time before it was actually released, but it's definitely enough of a step up from the 2600 and 5200 to justify its appearance here in the 3rd generation. The 4th generation is where we have to start making some real decisions, because a number of unique factors happened here. This is where we saw the first major publicized console war between Nintendo and Sega, a slew of competitors, and the introduction of industry-changing CD-ROMs. Let's start with the TurboGrafx-16. There's definitely an argument to be made that this system somehow belongs as more of a contemporary to 8-bit consoles, but let's be real here. This is where 16-bit gaming started. It's even in the name. So I believe it firmly lands here, and yes, by extension, this goes for the Turbo CD and Turbo Duo as well. The Super NES obviously lands here, and as does its counterpart, the Sega Genesis, and just like with the TurboGrafx, as does Sega CD. But now 32X, well, that's sort of a question mark, because it really was aiming to make the Genesis into a 32-bit machine, which would be the next generation. However, if we're looking at this from the intent of the system, I think the idea was more of a stopgap than an actual next-generation thing, especially considering the Saturn was right around the corner. It's also inextricably linked to the Genesis itself, so I think it has to stay here in the 4th generation. Next, let's look at Neo Geo. This one's a little wacky because it stayed on the market for a really long time, but even with its massive price tag and arcade-perfect capabilities, there is no doubt this system belongs in this generation when you look at its games. This naturally also applies to its counterpart, the Neo Geo CD. Sticking with compact discs, let's discuss the ill-fated Philips CDI. This is a real challenge because it wasn't really solely a games machine. This was a multimedia player. On one hand, its intent was clearly closer to what the following generation was aiming for. On the other hand, it was released all the way back in 1992, and its tech was way closer in power to what we were seeing on Sega CD. It really does feel like a mid-generational machine, but I'm inclined to put it in the 5th generation. Let me explain. Yes, it was released pretty early, but in terms of what this platform aimed to be, its intent, it wasn't out there to take on the likes of the Genesis or the Super NES. And this thing wanted to usher in a new generation with movie and music playback and more PC CD-ROM style adventures. I can see the argument for sticking it with the previous generation, but I honestly believe that if you look at what the system was aiming for, again, its intent, it is more in line with the PlayStation than the Super NES. It may seem weird, but I think this is more of a jump start to the 5th generation than a late 4th gen machine. Speaking of platforms that never lived up to their potential, we have the 3DO. I've seen it argued that since this platform died out in 1996, it should be considered part of the 4th generation, but again, this wasn't a platform designed to take on the Super Nintendo and the Genesis. It was meant to replace them. This was a next-generation system. That it didn't live long enough to see the launch of the Nintendo 64 doesn't change that. 3DO is firmly a 5th generation machine. So what of the Virtual Boy? Based on its name, we could ignore it entirely and stick it with the handhelds, but in reality, that thing was no more portable than a Super Nintendo, even if it could technically run on batteries. So where does it belong? I think it goes here. Granted, it only had 14 releases here in the US, but while they weren't all that different from what you'd see on the Super NES or Genesis, they were presented like an advancement over what had come before. I think the intent of the Virtual Boy was to be something more new than competition for stuff like Sega CD or 32X. This was Nintendo's 32-bit machine, for better or worse, and well, I think it goes here. Next, we have the Jaguar. Here's another tough one, because on one hand you have games like Bubsy and Pitfall the Mayan Adventure that were well in line with 4th generation releases. But this system also pushed polygons with stuff like Cybermorph, and it did so on a level that 16-bit machines simply could not. While I don't believe for a second that it actually achieved this, I do believe this platform's intent was to compete with the likes of whatever Nintendo and Sega were coming out with next. Like the 3DO, it didn't live long enough to even take its swing, but I'm going to put it here with the CDI and 3DO. Yes, Jaguar games feel a lot more in line with 32X than anything else, but I'm sticking to my guns, and yes, Jag CD is included. Then of course we have the 3 consoles that properly define this generation: the Sega Saturn, Sony PlayStation, and Nintendo 64. We all know how that turned out for all parties involved. Welcome to the top of the mountain, PlayStation. Thankfully, things start to become considerably more clearly defined from here. Sega kicked off the 6th generation with the Dreamcast. Now, I've heard it argued that this one belongs in the 5th generation, but that's malarkey. Dreamcast games have way more in common with what we were seeing in this generation than the last one. Nintendo finally ditched cartridges with the GameCube, Microsoft entered the market with Xbox, and Sony absolutely dominated with its DVD player-powered PlayStation 2. I think the only real point of confusion from here on out lies with Nintendo. Obviously, we have the generational leaps of the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, but the Wii wasn't really a more powerful console, just a radically different one. That said, a lot of this generation's games were defined by the advent of motion controls, so I believe in my heart of hearts that Wii belongs in the same generation as Microsoft and Sony's behemoths. The 8th generation sits in a similar boat thanks to Nintendo. PlayStation 4 and Xbox One are obvious next-generation consoles, but then you have to contend with the Wii U. Though its power is on par with the previous generation, its intent was to be Nintendo's next-generation system, so I say it goes here. And thanks to its unique multi-screen gimmick, unlike the Atari 5200, I say it succeeded in being a next-generation platform. However, that system also had an unusually short lifespan, which led to the Switch releasing well before anybody else's next generation, and it did so without achieving anywhere near the power capabilities of even this generation's PlayStations and Xboxes. That said, based on where we are now, I think it's only fair that the Switch lives in the 9th generation. Speaking of which, that catches us up to now, in the 9th generation of gaming platforms. Microsoft has the Xbox Series X and S, Sony has the PlayStation 5, and Nintendo has the Switch. They're the clear market leaders. But there are a few other doodads that belong here too, like Amazon Luna and Google Stadia. These things don't work with physical media, and they're more streaming platforms than anything else, but they do seem to be designed to be competitors to Microsoft and Sony's efforts. Or at least they were before Stadia kicked the bucket. But again, lifespan doesn't necessarily determine generational status. It's all about intent. So, what of the Atari VCS? Yes, this thing is still a thing, and it's still regularly getting new releases. It's difficult to see what this console's intent is, because, well, it's such an odd duck. It's not anywhere near powerful enough to compete with even most last-gen consoles, but if I don't miss my guess, I don't think it's intended to be a competitor in that regard. More a competitor for how you spend your time. That being the case, I think we have to base it on when it was released, which was 2020 for Kickstarter backers and 2021 for widespread release. I'm going to plop this one right here in Gen 9. Alright, let's take a look at the whole thing all together now. Generation 1, we've got your Magnavox Odyssey and various Pong clones. Generation 2 is the advent of interchangeable cartridges with the Fairchild Channel F, the Atari 2600, the Magnavox Odyssey 2, the Intellivision, Vectrex, ColecoVision, and Atari 5200. Generation 3 sees a move away from arcade-style games to larger adventures with Generation 3's NES, Sega Master System, and Atari 7800. Generation 4 is the 16-bit machines and the advent of CD-ROMs as well, with TurboGrafx 16, Turbo CD, Turbo Duo, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, Sega CD, Sega 32X, Neo Geo, and Neo Geo CD consoles. Generation 5 takes an arguable start super early with the Philips CDI, followed by the Panasonic 3DO, Nintendo's Virtual Boy 32-bit system. Yes, that's a 32-bit system. The Atari Jaguar, Jaguar CD, Sega Saturn, Sony PlayStation, and Nintendo 64. Generation 6 kicks off with Sega's Dreamcast, followed by the GameCube, Xbox, and PlayStation 2. Generation 7 is clear-cut with the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and Wii. Generation 8 is PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Wii U. And the current generation, Gen 9, is the Nintendo Switch, the Xbox Series, PlayStation 5, Amazon Luna, Google Stadia, and Atari VCS.
And there you have it. That is what I came up with as far as what systems belong in what generations. I know some of those decisions are a little bit controversial, especially around like the Atari Jaguar or the Philips CDI and all that kind of stuff, but I don't know. I think I made a pretty good case. But if I didn't, I would love to hear why. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you like what you saw here today, please follow, comment, like, subscribe, share, and like I said, let me know down in the comments, what did you think? Do you agree with my assessment of where these different consoles go? Or do you think I should shift things around? Do you think there is a clearly defined console generation to generation? Or do mid-generation systems really exist that can't be compared to the other things? Should the Virtual Boy just be considered a handheld? I don't know. Let me know. I love hearing from everybody. Thanks again for watching. On behalf of all of us here at Stone Age Gamer, keep playing games.
Will he or won't he? This is Tish Van Alden, and that's the hot question on everybody's lips during this primary season. Billionaire bachelor and business genius Reed Hawk has yet to commit himself to the race for the Oval Office. Well, hang on to your hats, folks, because he's gathering his flock this weekend to help him reach a decision. And when